Hi there. This is your instructor, Dr. Coleman, and I'm recording this today from our house here in Pocatello. We're fortunate enough to have a room in which we can have our piano and some other musical instruments. So I decided to go ahead and record this from our house. And in the next video, I'm going to be playing a song for you on the piano here so that you can hear what I'm talking about. And the topic now is modernity or modern times. So we're now shifting away from the Victorian era and into a time period that we call the modern era. So this shift, of course, doesn't happen immediately. It doesn't happen everywhere at the same time, but it's a clear trend that people are starting to shed the old ways, the old traditional ways of the Victorian era, and moving into this new modern time in the 1880s and early 20th century. So to get at this topic of modernity, I'm going to talk about modern sounds and modern music. So we're going to talk specifically about ragtime music. And I'm going to play you a piece that was composed by a man named Scott Joplin, who's kind of the premier ragtime composer and performer in this time period. So first, a little bit about Scott Joplin. He was born in 1868. We actually don't know his exact date of birth. That's been obscured and is unclear. But we know that he died in New York City in 1917. He was born in Texarkana and spent most of his life in the Midwest, actually in Missouri. He was born into a musical family. His mother was a vocalist and his father played guitar. He started out playing guitar as well, but then picked up the piano, played piano, and even had some musical lessons. So we know that he was from a decent family, middle-class family, since they could afford a piano and to provide him with music lessons. He then spent the rest of his life, he left home as a teenager and spent the rest of his life playing and composing music. He probably traveled around the Midwest and played in bars, in brothels. He may have played as entertainment for parties, and then wound up in New York City because he started to record his music. And at a place that became known as Tin Pan Alley, and I'll explain that in a minute. But first I want to talk a little bit about ragtime music. This might be familiar with you. If you watch the 1970s movie The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman, ragtime music was all over in that movie. It was the soundtrack to the film. So ragtime music became a fad in the 1890s and early 20th century. It became widely heard all over the country. So this is now an example of popular culture, of popular mainstream culture. It was hard to miss ragtime music unless you were really isolated. You would have heard it everywhere. It's connected to industrialization. This isn't a music that you would have heard prior to industrialization, or at least it wouldn't have become a fad for three reasons. One, it developed with the advent of recording music. So Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in 1877. That meant that people could purchase phonographs and purchase the recordings to play on them and play this kind of music at home. And so everybody who could afford one had a phonograph. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the rise of sheet music. It's called sheet music. So the song that I'm going to play for you, I actually just downloaded off the internet. This is not an example of sheet music. Sheet music was thinner, thin kind of cheap paper. It was mass produced. So it's music, but it's music that was produced for consumers to purchase and play. So that means that music is no longer just for the cultured, for the highbrow culture folks who can go to symphony, who play perhaps themselves and who got lessons, and who could only hear music that way. Now music is widely available for anyone who can afford a phonograph, for anyone who can afford some sheet music, and maybe take some rudimentary lessons and play it themselves. So music is becoming more widespread, and therefore it's also part then of popular mass culture. The third reason, or the third development that accompanied ragtime music, is the development of cheaply produced upright pianos, of which mine is not one. I love my piano. Uprights could be easily produced and mass produced. The pianos that were often produced this way tended to have a tinny sound. And so Tin Pan Alley in New York City was kind of in the midtown section of Manhattan there. And there were so many of these uprights with their tinny sound that they sounded, according to people who lived nearby, like a bunch of people rattling tin pans together. So that's why Tin Pan Alley how it got its name. Tin Pan Alley was also a place where people started to open recording studios so that this music could then be recorded and sold and so forth. So let me just say a bit about the word ragtime, because you might wonder, where does that come from? Well, in more traditional music, the rhythm of classical music tends to be very even, and it's not even the emphasized part of the classical piece. Classical music tends to be more melodic in terms of its emphasis. So this music, though, tended to emphasize the beat or the ragged rhythm. So that gives you the word ragtime. So the rhythm is syncopated here. You have often a steady march beat, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And if you're thinking, oh yeah, this is also the time when march music becomes popular, you're right. So John Philip Sousa is busily composing march music. If you've ever played in a marching band, you know that has a very steady rhythm to it. Well, what ragtime did is it took the offbeat and emphasized that offbeat, and it's emphasizing the rhythm, just like march music, but in ragtime you're emphasizing the offbeat. So I hope that you will be able to hear that when I play Scott Joplin's composition called Solace in the next video. So that is what defines ragtime music. It's also thought that ragtime music was influenced by African dance rhythms. Scott Joplin was an African American man. Certainly many of the people who played and these itinerant pianists were often African American people. And so it wouldn't be surprising to know that the influence here is old African drum beats. So that accounts for the sense of ragtime music initially as being kind of a subculture. Again, if you think about this time period, we're talking about the post-Reconstruction, and we'll talk about Reconstruction later, but this is after the Civil War. It's during the time after Reconstruction when the Old South returns to its old ways of white supremacy. This is the time when the Ku Klux Klan makes appearances and when there's lynching of African American people. And so it's a dangerous place to be black in the South. So it's not surprising that Joplin stayed in the Midwest. But the fact is that Americans all over the place were playing and hearing and embracing ragtime music. So that tells you something about how African culture is becoming more acceptable, at least for the broad mainstream American person. And that's something then that is a clear bridge between the Victorian era and the jazz era of the 1920s, is going to be this ragtime music. So by the time when jazz music develops, Americans are also embracing jazz music as something new and modern, and understanding that it's very much a music that's tied to African Americans in this country. So ragtime is important for that reason too, and it's important to realize the time period in which it develops. Okay, so the ragtime music, like jazz music, is also considered a uniquely American music, and that's because of this African American influence here. So I just wanted to read music critics' take on ragtime music so that you could try to get a better understanding of why we consider this music to be modern. So here's a music critic. He wrote this in a booklet called the Ragtime Booklet, which was kind of an instructor's manual on teaching people how to play ragtime music. So the quote here is, "The curiosity and even devotion of the young at the same time disquiets the staid and established. Ragtime created an attitude and defined an era that reached beyond music. So I want you to think about how this music could be described as disquieting and not staid, and how ragtime created an attitude. When I play the Solace piece, the composition by Scott Joplin, I want you to think about what attitude is being conveyed here. If you can possibly put yourself back in this time period and think about how a music could be disquieting and how it can reflect an attitude and how we could call that attitude modernity. Thanks.